Okay, Henry Lopez, the How of Business podcast and serial entrepreneur, and just like the number one choice for small business information on iTunes. And what an accomplishment! And you've been podcasting for 4 years now, but you've been in business serial entrepreneur as you are since 1991. You were telling me beforehand. And I was just so blown away by the variety of things that you've been involved with. So I feel like not only am I excited to talk to you about our topic today, but I wonder if you can get a little bit, give us a insight onto your journey in small business and how you became the How of Business podcast guy.
Sure. No, I appreciate it. And thanks for having me on your show. I'm looking forward
Yeah.
to this conversation. So as I mentioned before we started recording, I have always wanted to be my own boss since I can remember. A lot of reasons why. Primarily, certainly early on, it was about control. But early on, I didn't have the resources, didn't have the wherewithal, didn't have the knowledge, didn't have the courage. Certainly, it wasn't modeled for me necessarily. So always looking for that opportunity. When I moved from South Florida to Dallas in 1989, and one of the reasons I moved there is I had some friends there. And one of my friends in particular through high school worked at a local pizza franchise, small chain that's specific to the Dallas area. And so he and I got to talking. He had similar ambitions about starting something. And so we bought an existing pizza franchise location. It had been run down into the ground. The owner was desperate to get out of it, which was good in that he offered us a note. That was the only way I could afford this. I didn't have any credit back then, didn't have any savings, didn't have any family members to say, hey, lend me some money. But we had a lot of determination and want. I kept my day job. He worked it as a manager. We paid him a salary. And that's how I got started. And I did that most of the 90s. Never got it to a point where I could quit my job. I was fortunate that I had a very successful career in sales, software sales throughout most of the 90s. And so and a lot of people are faced with that, right? That when do I leave this quote unquote safety of a job and make the leap full time? And I struggled with that. Finally, in the 2000s, early 2000s, had an opportunity to do so. Went into real estate because that was always interesting to me. I wanted to go into real estate investment. So I did some of that, did that for about 5 years with mixed success. And then we had an opportunity when my other family members moved to the Dallas area where I was living to do a business together, which again, is something people will tell you, don't ever go into business with your family. But I've always leaned, Chris, towards partnering. That's just me. And we can talk about that if we have time. So we got into the salon business, a business I knew nothing about, sweet salons specifically, which when you stop and think about it is really a property management business. These hairstylists and estheticians and massage therapists, they didn't work for us. They leased suites from us. And we provided them common services and shared spaces and managed the space overall. So we owned that very successfully for 6 years and then sold it. In the meantime, got into the yogurt business just because I identified a trend there that wasn't existing at all in Colorado Springs, where my partner, David Begin, lives. And so that's why we did that. We still have that shop. He had been in the car wash business for many years. And so we opened a third location. He had 2 locations, opened a third location in the suburb of Denver. And then we sold those businesses last year. And then, as I mentioned, I'm in consulting and coaching in the podcast. The podcast came about, Chris, because it was intriguing, this medium for me that was new at the time 4 years ago. And I've always been frustrated. I'm a big reader of books about business and periodicals, and I consume, just like you do, as much as I can. But I always found that the tips and advice and the message was as if I was going to be the next Apple, right? The next big tech startup.
Right.
And I always was frustrated with translating that to how does that apply to my little micro business where I don't have an HR department or a marketing department. It's just me and maybe my partner. So the podcast comes from that. And that's what I still try to do, is to deliver actionable tips, real world actionable tips for micro business owners like me. And that was the impetus for starting the podcast.
That's beautiful. And it's very much close to my heart too, because that, interestingly enough, 4 years ago, myself did the same thing with coffee after a long career in coffee. And it's that same kind of that normal person who is in a small business situation who really just wants something to do tomorrow to make one small thing better that's actually a really big deal to them. And it's not necessarily a vision board that they need at that moment. It's maybe
Right.
a clipboard or something like
Right.
that, right?
Exactly.
And so let me see here. I think, as we're talking about just the how of business, and we're both kind of involved in that in different ways. You're now up to how many episodes now?
328, I believe. We do a weekly episode typically. Yeah.
And you do a lot of interviews and also probably solo content.
Yeah, I do some solos. I've been focused mostly on interviews for all kinds of different reasons, but will
Hmm.
do a solo episode as well. But yeah.
Well, the task at hand is to get some insights for small business at a time when small business is definitely hurting,
Right.
and it is the focal point for the financial strain of COVID-19, and is always classically, and maybe a little cliche to call it the backbone of country or a country, but it truly is. And so we wanted to focus on some stuff that is the connective tissue of good businesses. What makes a good small business? And you've come up with 5 things that you feel are most commonly associated with successful small business. And I think that's really special because you've got so much content out there, you have so much experience. And so I love that on the first one, you started with something from the guru himself, Michael Gerber, in the E-Myth. We've talked about on the show a little bit as well. And that's to work on your business and not in it. And I wonder if you can elaborate on that first point, because I think a lot of people feel that when they get into business, their purpose is to do everything and get their hands involved. And there's a fear that something is going to explode, or maybe they'll explode if they don't overcommit themselves to the business. So explain that point a little bit to us.
Sure. Yeah. And so much to unpack here, Chris, because
Yeah.
I mean, we could talk about this topic alone for hours, but you're right. Michael Gerber's The E-Myth. It is one of the questions I ask of every guest at the end is for a book recommendation. And The E-Myth is by far the number one recommended book. And it is still my first recommendation to anybody either getting into business or even a small business owner. The challenge with even after you read that book, I have found, Chris, is that people get it. But we'll talk about more about you getting it. But even once you get it, it's okay. Well, now what do I do? How do I do this? But before I get to that, the concept is exactly as you said. We most of us are type A personalities. We're probably perfectionists. I know I am. A lot of us, as he talks about in the book, are that technician. We used to do this thing maybe for somebody else. Now we're going to do it for ourselves. So we bring to it almost the entirely wrong focus after the initial period, right? Every small business, in my experience, certainly every business I've started, at the beginning, in that first 6 months to a year to 2 years, depending on your business, you have to be all in. There's no doubt about that, because I don't have the money to delegate or the resources to hire people. So that aside, I have to, the best takeaway I think from that book and the philosophy that I approach is think of it as if your plumbing business, you're going to franchise it to 1,000 units next year. Even if you have no plans to do so, you build the business with that in mind from day one. So what does that mean? Really, it's about developing those systems, those operating procedures, call it what you want, especially in those areas where things are repetitive. We do these things the same way every time. If it's in the plumbing business, we're going to try to answer the phone the same way. We're going to try to schedule an appointment the same way. We're going to follow up with the client the same way. We're going to bill the client the same way. We're going to use these tools and these systems to manage that transaction. That's all part of what we mean by developing systems such that at some point when it's appropriate, sooner than later, you can begin to delegate those tasks. And as a business owner, then we can focus on what we should be focused, which is outward facing on getting that new client and serving our clients. That's where we need to be, not in the back office generating invoices or doing those kinds of things that are repetitive. So a simple way that I recommend that people start with this is when we talk about systems, people immediately think of something very elaborate, and it can be, but it can be as simple as a checklist. Just developing a
Mm-hmm.
checklist. Before, as I was preparing for this conversation with you, I have a checklist for an appearance on a podcast. It is my system, even though it's simple and paper-based, to making sure that I execute at the highest possible level every time I'm on a guest, especially on a show like yours. You've taken the time and invested in me to have me come on and speak to your audience. I want to make sure I do the best job possible. So I have a system that helps me do that. So I want to make sure that that's a key takeaway here, Chris, that systems don't have to be this elaborate thing, but developing those systems a step at a time is how we get to a point where we start working on our business, meaning that we're not bogged down by the day-to-day. We can then focus on growing. Where do we go next with the business? And we can start getting the rewards of why we started a business, which is like time off, right?
Yeah.
So that's what it's about for me.
So to piggyback off of that, I think there's a question rolling in my mind about systems and how you mentioned simple systems as maybe a key to making this a part of what you do and to free your mind up. So what happens when we overcomplicate systems? Because I think I just got off the phone, for example, this afternoon with a client who's opening a coffee trailer in Kansas City. And there's like 4 weeks until like the first showing. And so there's a lot of systems involved, but then there's a lot of stress too. And there's just like, it has to be perfect. It has to be perfect and never pulling the trigger. Is that a risk? And what are maybe some other risks associated with like overcomplicating something that's supposed to make your life simpler?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. You've hit up something that I have a tendency to do, which is to overanalyze, overplan. Things have to be perfect. So my partner, David, began really help me with this in applying the 80-20 philosophy or rule. It applies to many different things, but I think it applies here as well, which is that for me, I have to let go of my perfectionism. 80% is good enough in most cases. And so that's first and foremost. But to your point, as you're starting a business and not letting that bog you down, I think that you don't try to have all of your systems perfectly in place before you launch, because it's only after you launch and start doing it that you really know how the process is going to work, despite all your best laid plans, right? Now, you got to have some plan. If I'm going to be serving coffee, obviously I got to have some plans to how I'm going to take the order, how I'm going to make it, what is my system, where do the cups go? All of those kind of things have to be laid out. But the reality is, as I'm sure you found, it's only after you've been open for a few weeks that you moved everything around anyway, and your best laid plans got adjusted anyway. So what I like to do as an example is I like to develop those systems. Let's take the checklist approach, for example. As I'm starting to do these things in those first few weeks, those first few months. So if every day we're opening the coffee shop by memory, that's okay. And I don't think you should try to develop necessarily a very comprehensive system ahead of time. Develop instead a very high level outline. We got to unlock the door. We got to turn off the alarm. We got to turn off this. We got to turn on this machine. We got to check this. We got to check the tables, whatever that at a high level. And then fine tune it. Maybe not every day, but maybe at the end of the week, you sit down and say, we need to add this, we need to change this, we need to add this to the list. And you evolve that checklist for opening the shop, let's say.
Right. It's a living document.
It's a living doc. And even better, if you do have staff, delegate it to them to document it. And then you review it and work with them on, well, what about this? And why aren't we doing this? And why did you take this off of there? But incorporate that. So that's an approach I like to take once they get to the point where they have staff, where they're hiring an assistant or whatever. Let that person create at least a first draft of that procedure, that process, that checklist.
Now, that kind of gets into the second thing that you're mentioning on the 5 kind of keys to successful small business, and that's the delegation. And you've hinted at it a couple of times now. Letting them do it is sort of the heart of delegation. right? Letting go of some of the control of that. Um, Talk a little bit about the process of initially delegating, and then maybe some ideas of like how we might sabotage our own efforts in delegating because we really don't want to, but we're just going to try it because Henry says we should.
Right. This is a big one, Chris, because I think you really have to check yourself. I struggled with this because, again, I'm a perfectionist. I'm a type A. I'm a control freak. So, and this is my business and I want it done a certain way. And again, this is something that my partner are helping with a lot and I've come a long way on. One of the things he helped me see and that I really believe in now is that even though, maybe I'm the one that has the experience, Chris, and I've just brought you on and I'm going to delegate something to you. And my concern immediately is going to be, well, he doesn't have the experience and the knowledge that I have, so he's going to miss things. But on the flip side, Chris has experiences and knowledges that I don't have, and he is likely going to bring something to it that I didn't think about. He might be the one that's there day to day and seeing how customers are reacting to a particular policy or approach or product. And so I have to listen to that approach and that perspective. Now, I'm going to have veto right and say, no, I still want you to do it in this sequence, Chris. But that's what you get from delegating that it took me a while to learn, is that if you've hired right, if you're surrounded yourself with people that you believe in, they have value to contribute as well that you can't see. So look at it from that perspective. And then to your point of undermining it, that is the worst thing you can do. If you want to end up 5 years from now where only you can run that shop, and if you don't show up, everything goes to heck, then keep undermining delegation, and that's where you'll end up. Where only you can make a decision, where only you can do it the certain right way. Instead, what you're testing by implementing systems and by delegating is that the shop can run without you. And that is the ultimate test. But we have to check our ego, because sometimes what happens is, well, shoot, then what value do I bring if it can run without me, right? So I think sometimes it's a mindset as much as anything else, Chris. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And it feels like something that I've said to people who are getting ready to open shops is that the idea that you're going to open this shop because you like coffee shops is not a good enough reason to open a coffee shop.
It is not.
Because the way that you enjoy a coffee shop as a customer is a different animal, and you have to relearn how to enjoy what you do, or just, bear the pain of watching what you love die before your eyes.
Right.
And that's just the way it is, because there's so much stuff that you didn't know was behind the scenes of that enjoyment. But if that mindset, like you said, is so key to just make sure that if you're going to make that decision to delegate, then it's a long-term decision and not something that you're just testing the waters on. And you brought up a point that I'd like to hear more about, and that's if you hired right in the delegation process, because a lot of people are hired not because we have confidence that they can handle the work, but we have confidence that we can boss them around.
That's a
right?
good point.
So how do we avoid just sort of stocking our staff full of people who are very much dependent on our presence, and then doing the opposite of that?
Yeah. And in particular, in the type of business we're talking about here, often we're talking about hourly wage employees. They might be young people. We have this challenge with my yogurt shop right now. That's who we are employing just out of high school, young people. We know they're not going to be with us forever. We know that. Hourly wage people. And I will tell you what I've been surprised by again and again and again is that I find that most people, even young people, want to do the right thing and want to take pride in their jobs if you will just let them. And what they need from you is you got to hire the right people, right? And I believe, especially in these environments, that personality and character completely is more important than have you ever worked at a coffee shop before. That's my opinion. Yeah. So that's what I mean by you hire right. Then you have to invest in them. And what I mean by that is you have to invest in them in training and in coaching and in giving them the tools so that they can do the right job. The tools are those systems that we've talked about. The training is, I'm going to invest in you because I value you, that I'm not just going to throw you out there to face the customer before you even know what you're doing. And what I have found again and again, Chris, and I'm sure you have, is that when you do that, people who are employees respond to that and respect that. And then part of hiring right is also firing right. You got to get those people out who don't fit. And you don't often know that until they're with you for 30 days, 60 days, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm talking about there. And I think that if you give people and you empower them, right? There's organizations that do this very well. By empower them, I mean, they don't have to turn around and look at me for every decision that they're going to make, especially as it relates to customer service. I empower them to take care of the customer. Because fortunately, in the type of business that we're talking about, we're not giving away cars or $100,000 items here, right? It's a cup of coffee.
Yeah.
So at our yogurt shop, similarly, they're empowered that if a customer says, I don't like this mix that they even created themselves, because ours is self-serve, they're empowered to say, let me take that, go and create yourself another one. Right. They're looking out for that exception of people who are going to take advantage of it. But what I have found is that the vast majority of customers are not trying to take advantage of us. So that's part of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And also to that end, the vast majority of employees are not trying to take advantage of you either.
That's what I have found.
Yeah, and that's very hard for people to understand, I think, especially if you're older and you're managing. Often for the first time, you're in a leadership position, because a lot of people have a pension that they want to spend on opening their dream shop, and then they're in charge of 4 or 5 staff members in their early 20s, and they're just like, oh geez, now I gotta manage millennials and Gen whatevers, and it becomes an us versus them thing, where we imagine the worst case scenario about people that are out to get us.
That's right.
And that really is the mindset that eats away at what could be a successful mindset, which empowers people, like you were just saying, empowering your employees to make decisions that they know you'll be okay with. I guess means that you need to be clear about what those things are yourself. And unless you are, then there's really no way for them to feel the freedom unless it's clearly communicated to them.
That's right. Yeah. And you'll never, going back to our first point, you'll never get to a business that you can step away from unless those rules are clear to them and they can execute them on your behalf. If you have to make every decision, then you really have not started a business. You've just started a job, and it's probably going to end up being a lower paying job than the one you had. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, that's not to mean we're not saying that you should not have systems and controls and audits in place to make sure the money doesn't disappear. That's not what we're saying, right? But what we're saying is that what you and I have both found is that most employees, and you want to eliminate temptations and so forth, and we're not saying you don't do that. That's part of your systems. Yes. But by and large, people want to do the right job. That's been my experience.
And so now I think this kind of segues pretty well because of its seeming contrast to point number 3 that you make. And you're talking about having a kind of a ruthless approach to money and making profits your first priority financially. And when I see people create situations where they're doubting people's integrity and things like that, it's always around money, it seems to be.
Sure.
And so let's get into that a little bit, like profit first, and then, being ruthless about your money, but also in a way that doesn't undo some of what we just talked about.
That's right. Yeah. And what I'm talking about here, the ruthlessness is not with, I'm going to count every penny at the end of every shift. I mean, there are going to be procedures there, but this goes back to Chris. The mistake I see here starts even when people are planning a business. And you see it all the time as well. People are not even willing to put in the effort to put together a financial projection before they launch. They think that my enthusiasm and my love for coffee is enough and people will come. And they don't validate and work with someone like you to see, at this location with my fixed costs and what I'm going to charge in this market, can I project that I'm going to make money? And then once I get started, I have to manage it to a big extent by the financials. This is either a hobby or it's a business. And if it's a business, it's all about profits.
Yeah.
I see so many business owners that they've been going at it for years and they still can't clearly tell me what was your profit last year. The only way they manage it is, well, there's a little bit left over most months in the bank account. Sometimes I keep having to put money in. That is no way to manage a business. I understand why it happens, because the hardest thing for us to do as business people to say, this is not working. I either need to completely pivot, which we'll talk about in a moment, or stop, right? That's hard to do because it means we're giving up to some of us. But you have to be ruthless about it. There's lots of books. I just had a gentleman, Michalowicz. I always have a hard time with his last name, but he
Oh
wrote a
yeah,
book.
yeah,
Yeah. Profit First. Yeah.
yep.
And so and there are other books on this topic. And I learned this several years ago. And what I started doing this with the salon business on a yearly basis. My budget planning started with, we're going to, based on what we did last year, realistic is, let's say it was 25% profit at the end of the year. That kind of, from a budgeting perspective, got brought out first. And then I allocated, okay, that means we have X for advertising, X for janitorial services, all of those variable expenses.
Yeah.
So it's a mindset, as an approach of planning your business by taking your profit first. Yeah.
I like that a lot, in that you're leaving room for margins of not error, but counting pennies, for instance. There's always going to be, sometimes you get a zero drawer, and sometimes you get some up or down, like
That's
5
right.
cents, 25 cents, sometimes it's $2. And it is, I think, somewhat of a waste of time. If you got a good system in place, you can just chalk it up to human error,
Agreed.
and not a grand conspiracy. Somebody's funneling money, like $5 every month to retire in Maui or whatever. But the
Right.
profit first idea, it really makes me think about how the people that are having the most fun in your field are the people who have more money to play with in their business. So if you really want to enjoy working in coffee, then it makes sense that you would want to become flush with cash to be able to fix problems, to pay your employees more, to make happier employees, and you yourself can pay yourself more and
That's right.
feel at ease to be more creative with what you do. But if you're just like constantly behind, then that's the drudgery of small business. But people, I don't know if you found this, but sometimes I think people just do that. They view that as a badge of honor.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's almost like, okay, I'm enduring this pain, but this is the way it's done. And I really
Yeah.
think, Chris, is because no one has ever helped them with analyzing that. And really, one of the things I have found, if you're listening to this and that's you, my suggested first step, and I suspect that what I find goes in correlation, is those people haven't looked at their financials, or they haven't updated their QuickBooks in months, and so they don't want to look at it. It's very similar to the way we treat our personal finances, I have found. What I have found is, if you will dig in there and work with your CPA or an accountant and get a handle on it, even if the picture is bad, it's this burden of relief to say, okay, now I know what I have ahead of me, and I can put together a plan, hopefully with some help, to see how we can't turn this around. But you can't continue to beat yourself down, as you're saying, and ended up living in this misery because you don't want to admit that maybe the business isn't working, that the business model doesn't work. And that's, to your point, this big separation between I love coffee and everything around it to I want to run a business that offers that. Two big differences. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it even goes down to just your personal choices in careers. As Cal Newport has the book, So Good They Can't Ignore You. He talks about how your passion for a thing is not necessarily a good reason to pursue it as a business. I even found myself as a 42-year-old, older, quote unquote, guy talking to a younger guy saying, it'd be better if you just try to do something where you can make enough money so you can do what you want to do later. And it seems like it fits because we want to be behind the bar. We
Right.
want to be ordering coffee and green coffee, on the phone with the importers, cupping coffee, and doing the fun and romantic parts of the job to juice us up about being in that career. And like Mike Michalowicz talks about in that book, he breaks the news to people through this survey that he does in his Profit First book, he talks about this. So people just break down sobbing because they didn't realize how bad it was.
Right, right. But I find that once you get past that, after you break down, and now at least you've got a clear picture of what it is and what it isn't, you can stop fooling yourself, work with someone if you need to see if we can't turn it around or move on to something else.
And is it helpful? It seems like it'd be helpful to try to connect what you're doing in the numbers to the greater goal, the vision, because it does sound very taxing, no pun intended, to look at all of that stuff and feel like, well, this is too much. This is not why I got into business. But like, how do you recommend people just get over that hump to stay with it long term? Because it's one thing to dive in and say, okay, now I know I'm never going to look at it again. It's another thing to make it a part of what you do on the daily.
Yeah. You know, what I would say in part, Chris, is you got to grow up. This is what being a business owner entails. Yeah.
Sure.
But get help. So once you do have it cleaned up, if you don't, then we're not saying that you have to be the one bogged down into the transactions of this, but you do have to learn how to read your P&L. You do have to learn, and depending on the business, your cash flow statement. In the coffee shop, you don't have that, so you don't have to worry too much about cash flow. But you got to learn about inventory and managing inventory. You got to look at your P&L, and that is just a requirement. And I think once you start doing that on a regular basis, it hopefully isn't as big of a chore. And I hear it. I hear it all the time as you do. Well, I'm not a numbers person, so I don't look at that. I say you can't get away with that. I say being a business owner requires you to pay some attention. You cannot relinquish responsibility for your financials. You can have help with it, your accountant, your bookkeeper, whatever. You need that. Your CPA certainly at the end of the year to give you guidance. But that's part of being a business owner is what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah, and I feel like right now people are finding that out in a very difficult way. As we see a lot of businesses closing. I just saw an Instagram post of a 20-year-old shop in Seattle closing, and it's not because they didn't have the money. It's just because it is a very difficult area to be in. It's a difficult landscape economically. But then there are other shops that didn't do this, and they were maybe the more poorer performing stores amongst 4 or 5 stores that were the first to close. So for people who have multiple locations, there are those locations where it's just like, it's evident that maybe it should have been closed a little bit ago.
Right.
But I think a lot of people are thinking hard about how to stay on track with their finances as they're pivoting. And that's your 4th point, as they're trying to adjust and shift the way that they do business and find multiple streams of income. And we've got mobile ordering and curbside pickup and all that stuff in the food service, beverage industry. So on that point, I want to, have you expand on that a little bit. How can we take that on in not necessarily a timid way, but in a way that really is, effective in a bold way?
Yeah. I think it comes to, I've given this a lot of thought because I'm reading a book now by Gino Wickman, his latest book that talks about some of this, the requirement for you to be a business owner that you have to be a problem solver. I think that we might come into business often thinking that, all right, I'm going to get it all together. I'm going to run the business, and then let's hope we don't have any interruptions. In other words, that the world doesn't happen. The reality is that this has been unprecedented and dramatic, but this is business, right? Things happen that I cannot predict. When we were in the car wash business, for example, it fortunately never happened to us, but there have been car washes where people have been injured and even killed workers in the tunnel.
Wow.
That's not something you plan for, but when it happens, it's catastrophic. When I was in the pizza delivery business, fortunately, none of my drivers ever hit anybody or caused major damage, but it was always a possibility, always an exposure, right? So those are extreme things because what we've had here is extreme. But the point I'm trying to get to is that as business owners, we always have to be looking at, where do I pivot? Where do I shore up exposure? What's changing? Because nothing stays the same. So I want to start with kind of that first point, that it is a mindset thing. We can look at this as, oh my gosh, why did this have to happen? Well, stuff happens. We couldn't see it coming. And here we are. So now what we have to do is we have to try best we can to adjust. I get it. For those of you who have had to shut down or on the verge of shutting down, my words don't help, right? Everything you invested, probably financially and certainly in your effort, is maybe down the drain. I get that. I think all we can try to do is, first of all, look at it as, listen, there was nothing I could have predicted. What can I do now? How creative can I be to see if I can't survive this and maybe come out at the other end? Maybe a very different business model, because we don't know what if this is going to survive, but let's see if we can get through this. So I think more than anything else, Chris, it's a mindset that this is part of being a business owner. Do you agree with that?
Oh yeah, sure. It stems from the mindset, but then also that taking action to pivot with boldness into an area that you're unfamiliar with. That part is, we just got done talking about doing things that you don't like to do with the finances. And up until this point, if you have been the type of person that likes to just focus on the things that you're really, really good at and completely ignore things that you don't like doing, then this is doubly hard, because you may really hate the idea of starting an online store or doing curbside pickup or something like that. So how do we translate mindset into bold action in a way that's sustainable, even in the midst of something that's so emotionally taxing as like the global pandemic?
Yeah. And a couple of things as you were saying that, what immediately came to mind is and I'm sure you saw it as well, it was surprising, but it shouldn't have been, how many of my clients or people that I spoke to were paralyzed on what to do with all of the government programs, the EIDL and the PPP program. Amazing to me how many people just chose to not do anything because they were paralyzed. So I think I'll begin to answer your question by, we have to, as entrepreneurs and as business owners, take bold action, even if we think it may not be the right answer, because what's happening to us here is we're being asked to make changes that we don't know if they're going to work or not. Sure. So we have to be comfortable with that. We have to be bold enough to say, let's try this and let's fail as fast as possible and see where do we find the right mix of changes that work for us. You can't we didn't have the luxury at our yogurt shop of spending 3 weeks analyzing, should we go to online ordering? We've never done that, but how do we do that? Because this is a self-serve model, and how is that going to work? Well, we just did it, and we stumbled a little bit, and we figured things out, and we made some adjustments, and we did it, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that the message I would send on this, Chris, is you have to shift. Don't allow yourself to get paralyzed, and just do, understanding that everything you do is not going to be right. You're going to make mistakes, and hopefully you can make changes that are not going to catastrophically impact your business, but that you can trial and error as we kind of figure out where you want to redirect, what's going to work in your particular market for your particular set of circumstances, right?
Yeah, we're back to that trial and error thing. And just when we say take bold action, I think a lot of times we conflate boldness with expertise or certainty. And it's like I tell my son about fear, because we're taking him through, he's 6 and we're going through all the Jurassic Park movies now. So we're trying to figure out what, the intersection of fear and bravery is, and how to define those things. And it's just a good lesson for every one of us that we don't know if it's going to work out, but you don't really get points for not trying, right?
That's right. And it is our responsibility as entrepreneurs and business owners to do so. Dan Sullivan, a strategic coach, talks about this concept of courage. It's about having the courage. It's not confidence. Confidence comes later. It's about having the courage to try something, even if we don't know, if we don't have all of the answers. Because if we wait, it's too late. Right?
Yes.
If we wait, it's too late. So we've seen that. I've seen that with the loan programs. I see it with making decisions about something. I see it again and again. Unfortunately, nobody's going to come along and say, Chris, you will make these decisions and they will be right and your business will prosper. That's not the way it works. I wish it
Yes.
did, but it's not. So we just have to be bold enough, like you said, but we have to accept that responsibility that is our responsibility and role as the owner to make those bold decisions.
Yeah. And as you do that, it really comes back to the kind of culture that you set for the people that you're leading, that they see you taking action. And if you do have what you were talking about, an empowered staff who can make decisions based on the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law necessarily, um, they can create solutions for you as well. They will take on that same behavior
Absolutely.
because they see you demonstrating it, in that, well, I don't need to be 100% certain about something to bring it to my boss as an idea. You know, not every boss is like that.
Right.
And some bosses will um, rake you over the coals for, bringing something that doesn't work. But that really squashes the creativity that I think we now especially see is such a precious commodity, especially in a small business. Because, I mean, I guess even big businesses are closing like tons of their outlets, even Starbucks and other places like that. But they can afford to be wrong about so many more things than we cannot
Right.
afford to be wrong about. Um, and so we need more ideas, and we need to try things faster, right? And it kind of comes back to agility, to be able to pivot. So it's not just pivoting into something that will work, but I guess you tell me, it's like you might go through 3 or 4 ideas before you hit on something that works. And
Absolutely.
pivoting means going between those things quickly and iterating quickly, right?
Yeah, that's been my experience,
Yeah.
and that's what we're seeing. I had this conversation with a friend of mine yesterday because we were talking about this. He's a volunteer for SCORE, as I am, and we're putting together a workshop on this post-COVID thing. What's the
Mm,
impact? And the thing I shared with him is that I think that at the end of the day, if we're really entrepreneurs, we have to be okay with and embrace that this could, at the end of this, we could have a completely different business than we did beforehand.
yeah.
If that's a problem for you, then perhaps it's part of what you talked about, that I went into this thinking it was this ideal I had for a coffee shop, not that I'm a business owner. So we got to become one. I'll give you an example of a pivot. I have a client and friend of mine who had a yoga studio for 15 years. Yoga, you would have thought, is a very high touch, very high contact type of thing, of service. But she has, and it was forced by COVID, has shifted to a completely online model.
Wow.
She's doing training, teacher training online. She's a yogi, so she trains other people how to become yoga instructors. She's doing classes. If you would have mentioned or thought about that a year ago, people would have said, that'll never work. You can't do yoga online. Well, she's making it happen. Now, she's going to end up at the end of this. She actually closed her physical studio. Now, there were other things that were going on prior to COVID, so that wasn't the only thing. That was just the catalyst, the final straw.
Okay.
But it's an example of how we might end up with, at the end of this, a completely different business. Now, I know that's harder to translate when we're talking about something like a coffee shop, but I think the point we're trying to communicate, Chris, is that nobody has a crystal ball here. What we have to do, as you've talked about, is be willing to act boldly and quickly and see if we can't figure out how we get through this, and then we'll see how we end up at the other end, at
This
the other
is
side of this.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily the box of COVID that we need to put everything into, because
Good
everything
point.
that we're just talking about made sense 10 years ago and will make sense 10 years from now for a small business. And the people who had been practicing it 10 years ago and until now are the better for it, obviously. So yeah, I think maybe it would be a mistake to think, well, these are COVID measures. Well, maybe it's
Right.
just that COVID is bringing up common sense measures.
Good point. I agree. And just
Mm,
to go back to the money part of it for a moment, the other thing that it has highlighted is we should have had working capital to get us through something like this. We should have properly funded our businesses, but we didn't, because we didn't look at the numbers like we should have, right? We should have had those extra funds to carry us. And so that's something that, again, we should take forward so that we can overcome the next crisis that comes our way as business owners.
yeah, well said. So your final point is kind of, I like the idea a lot, and it's to enjoy the journey. And as we've talked about this, we've just been up and down different mountains and valleys, and doing small business and putting yourself out there for public opinion and the survival of your family and all that stuff.
Right.
It is an adventure, right?
It is.
So it might be easy to be, not enjoying the journey. And it sounds pithy to say it, real cliche to say enjoy the journey, but talk to us about why it's absolutely essential that we focus on making sure that we enjoy it along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for making that clarification, because for those of you who are listening who are struggling and might have to close at the end of this month, I get it. Enjoy what, right? We get that. Here's where this came from for me, Chris, and then it might make more sense. I come from what I observe as the common approach, which is that success in business was only going to be measured once I attained this, mostly tied to somebody else's measure of that. So the yogurt shop was the first time I really thought about this consciously. I aspired to have franchised that concept, and I would love to be sitting with you here talking about how we have 300 units and we're growing. But I purposely thought, because I had done similar things to myself before, if that's the only way I'm going to measure success and enjoy this, boy, I'm really going to be disappointed. Instead, what I wanted to was to enjoy as much as possible, all of it, the journey of building it, even the struggles. That doesn't mean every day I enjoyed it. Okay. There were days, when you're negotiating a lease or have equipment delays, or the finish out isn't going to be done in time, or whatever your challenges might be. I'm not telling you I was joyful every day, but I tried to embrace it all as that this is what it's about. And the fact that I opened my shop and there was my ideas that were being manifested, and it was my effort and my creation, and that it was because of me and my partner. That's what I mean by enjoying the journey, appreciating what a privilege and what hard work has given me the opportunity to do this, where I get to be my own boss. Now, there's a lot that's up to chance, a lot that's up to luck. I really had a hard time believing that, but we put our business forth, and then something like COVID happens. Well, how the heck was I supposed to predict that, right?
Right.
But if I enjoyed the process, then it's not tied to what is really external measures of success or enjoyment of what I'm doing. I try to now enjoy the journey of being an entrepreneur and a business owner. And hopefully that ends up in resulting in a profitable, successful business. But there's only so much of that I can control. So if I'm going to wait until that happens, until this arbitrary measure or somebody's other external measure, it goes back to the point I made about why I started a podcast. If I wait until I become the next Apple, that's going to be a miserable life. Instead, I want to try to appreciate this opportunity and this journey that I'm on. And so that's what I mean by that.
Yeah, it's a great perspective. And I hear trust the process or enjoy the process and live in the now. And it's unfortunate that there's a lot of, pithy sayings that we can blow off. It's easy to just say, well, that's somebody selling a wall hanging on Etsy that has it on there. But it is absolutely true, because here's back to me being like a middle-aged person again, but we're not getting any younger. And if you're going to waste your time with something or being just, I don't know, disillusioned or just not enjoying it, and not realize that some of it's up to you to enjoy it, then you're going to find that maybe it will never work out,
That's
and
right.
you missed a lot of joy in the process. And I'm just so glad you're looping this back into just enjoying it, because there are a lot of happy people with very little small businesses.
That's right.
That have, their family is taken care of. They feel gratified. Their community loves them. Lots of people are going to be at their funeral. I mean, it's just where are your values, right?
Agreed. Or otherwise, as you had mentioned to the advice you gave to somebody, maybe owning a business is not really for you. Once you get past the romantic idea of owning the coffee shop, maybe
Sure.
you should go into a career or do something else. So I think that hopefully that's a takeaway, that if you can't do this, and I get it, right now is trying times, I get it. But if by and large you can make that mind shift change to the things we've talked about, to embracing the journey, to being a problem solver, to embracing that, to taking bold action, then you have to really stop and think as to whether owning a business is really for you.
Hmm. Wow. That's a hard thing.
It
But
is. It is a hard
honesty,
thing.
yeah, being honest up front is probably better than having to be honest much later.
That's
Right.
right. That's right.
So we've gone through all of these, and Lord knows there's so much minutia, there's so much more, but
Of
these are
course.
great guideposts for people. Going from this conversation, how do we take action on these? How would you suggest that somebody listening to these 5 things take the first step into it? Because we would maybe want to just do all 5 right now,
Right, right.
but what's a healthy way to integrate these into our practice?
Yeah, good question. I think maybe, Chris, in light of where we are today with especially coffee shops struggling with how do they reopen, I think maybe I would focus on the point that we talked about on taking bold action. So I would challenge you to that thing that you've been putting off, or that decision that you have just been mulling over again and again and again. Make a decision, take a step, take some action. If it's that you haven't even looked at your financials for a couple months because you don't want to know what it tells you, go do that. Spend a couple hours, dig in and do it. You're going to feel better afterwards, even though it's going to be painful. What I always find is once you wrap your arms around the problem, it feels better. And then the technique I always use for problem solving is to take this huge insurmountable problem and see if you can't break it down into attainable small steps. Okay.
Yeah.
Let's say it's, this month is the last month I'm going to be able to pay my lease. I haven't even had a conversation with my landlord. Take that first step. Make that phone call. Start that conversation. You never know where it might go. So that's what I would recommend on starting to take those bold decisions and actions now. Stop being paralyzed, even though I get it. I understand why you are, but take bold and decisive action. Then, related to what we talked about with systems, start looking at the things that are repetitive, that are done the same way every day, and start there. Start there with a simple checklist, and that'll get you started with this mindset of where else can we implement systems, using that term loosely, so that this place starts to run more efficiently and so that it doesn't always depend on me being here. So those are 2 takeaways I would recommend.
Perfect. Yeah, that's how you do it. And Henry, this has really been fantastic to have you on the show. And I really enjoy your podcast. To recommend people subscribe. And where else can they go to learn more about what you offer with your consulting and other services?
Sure. Thehowofbusiness.com. At thehowofbusiness.com, you'll find the podcast as well as everything else that I offer in the way of coaching and consulting.
Awesome. Well, thank you again. Amazing insights, and can't wait to tune in again to your next episode.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me. Great conversation.